Do you believe that a person can live under the same roof for 32 years and know absolutely nothing about their parents' past? Do you believe that a husband and wife can bury a secret for 35 years, bury it so deep that even they forget it ever existed? Do you believe that at 35,000 feet, a stranger can look at your face, call out your parents' names, and casually tell you that you have an aunt you've never heard of, and that she was left behind at a train station in China 35 years ago? Do you believe that your mother's deepest secret has been hiding in a rusty tin box under your television stand for half her life? I didn't believe any of it. Not until the night I boarded the red-eye flight from Boston to San Francisco. My name is Ethan Shin. I'm 32 years old. Before those 6 hours in the air, my life was simple: a job as a data engineer, a rented apartment in Silicon Valley, and parents who lived in the suburbs outside San Francisco. I thought I knew them the way I knew the small mole on the back of my neck. I never had to think about it, but it was always there. I was wrong. I was so wrong. For 35 years, my parents thought they had hidden it well. They were like two co-conspiring prisoners, building a wall of silence around something they refused to acknowledge. They never talked about that year. Never mentioned that place. Never answered calls from that region of the country. There wasn't a single old photograph in the house, no tattered album, no piece of paper that could be traced back to 1988. That year was a missing puzzle piece in my family's history, edges sanded smooth, as if it had never existed. My father, George Shin, is a retired chemical engineer. My mother, Margaret Chin, is a seamstress. They immigrated to the United States when I was 10 years old, and they have never gone back. Go back for what? My father would always answer whenever I asked. His voice was flat, like he was reciting a script he'd memorized long ago. What's done is done. My mother was even more absolute. Every time I brought up back home, her fingers would tighten, her lips pressing into a thin white line. It wasn't sadness I saw, it was fear. A fear that had been refined over 35 years, forged into her very bones, as much a part of her as her heartbeat. I once asked her if we had any relatives on her side of the family. They're all dead, she said. How did they die? Old age, she said, and then she changed the subject to what she was making for dinner. I'd always felt, since childhood, that there was a hole in our house. Not a crack you could see, more like a dip in the floorboards covered by a rug. You could feel it under your feet when you walked across that spot, a slight give, but you couldn't quite name what was wrong. Sometimes my father would stand at the kitchen stove staring out the window until the oil in the pan started smoking, jolting him back to the present. Sometimes my mother would stop mid-sentence while folding laundry, gripping the sleeve of an old shirt as if trying to identify something. Those moments were brief, too brief to form a question, but long enough to leave a faint groove in my memory. I'm 32, single, a database architect at a mid-sized tech company in Silicon Valley. Life runs on a schedule: up at 7:30, oatmeal and coffee, a 30-minute drive to the office, 3 screens of code until evening, occasional overtime, the gym on weekends, frozen dumplings always in the fridge. I've had 2 girlfriends. Both left because I was too quiet. I don't think I'm quiet, I just have a habit of holding things in, thinking them through completely before I speak. Maybe that habit grew out of that sealed-off family secret, the one that taught me not to ask certain questions, until eventually I stopped asking any at all. Then came that flight. It was a Tuesday in November. I'd just finished a tech conference in Boston and was on the red-eye back to San Francisco. Window seat, row A. When I sat down, the aisle seat was empty, but the middle seat was already taken by an old man. He looked to be in his early 70s, wearing a faded gray-blue jacket with frayed threads at the collar. His graying hair was neatly combed to one side, and a pair of old-fashioned gold-rimmed glasses sat on his nose. He was flipping through a yellowed notebook, its pages curled at the edges from being opened countless times. When he saw me sit down, he looked up and offered a small smile. It was the kind of tired kindness that comes from a long life lived, a winter sun, not hot, but warm. "Young man," he said, his voice hoarse with a distinct southern accent, the words drawing out at the ends, "do me a favor. After takeoff, open this bottle for me. My hands, arthritis. Can't get the grip." I took the water bottle he handed me and nodded. The cap was tight. I tested it, making sure I'd be able to twist it open. The plane taxied, accelerated, lifted off. Outside the window, Boston's lights shrank into a handful of gold dust, swallowed by the black ocean, with only the red wingtip lights tracing lonely arcs across the darkness. When the seatbelt sign clicked off, I opened the bottle and handed it to him. "Thank you." He took it but didn't drink, just held it, gazing out the window. "How long is this flight?" "About 6 hours." 6 hours. He repeated the words as if tasting their weight. "Long enough for a story." I didn't respond. Strangers on planes talk to fill the silence, 90% of the time, that's all it is. I pulled out my headphones, ready to put them on. "You're a Shin, aren't you?" he said suddenly. My hand stopped in midair. "What did you say?" The old man turned his head, and in the dim cabin light, his eyes behind those gold-rimmed glasses gleamed with an unusual intensity. He was looking at me with a seriousness I'd never seen on a stranger's face, the kind of seriousness that felt like a key, trying to turn a lock that had been rusted shut for 35 years. "You look just like your father," he said. "Your father is George Shin, right? Your mother is Margaret Shin. Your name is Ethan Shin. Born in 1992. And you have an aunt named Lily Shin." The hum of the airplane's air conditioning suddenly seemed deafening. My back pressed against the seat, the headphone cord tangled around my fingers. I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding through my ribs, slow, heavy. "How do you know my parents?" I asked. My voice came out drier than I expected, like sandpaper scraping my throat. The old man didn't answer right away. He looked down, unscrewed the bottle, took a sip, then sealed it and set it on the tray table. His movements were slow, as if he was waiting for the right moment. Outside the window, faint stars clung to the glass, motionless. 35 years ago, he said, I saw your aunt for the last time. His name was Raymond Joe. When he said it, his voice carried a distant calm, like someone reciting an address that hadn't been spoken aloud in a long time. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket pocket and showed me a faded press credential inside. It read Southern Metropolitan Daily. The photo showed a young man with thick black hair and sharp eyes. Summer of '88, he said. I was taking the train from Guangzhou to Changsha. I was barely 30 then, just starting my third year as a journalist, covering social news. That train was packed. I had a standing ticket, 6 hours, from boarding to arrival, and I never found a single seat. He paused, took another sip of water, as if he needed it to moisten the dry edges of the memory. The carriage was a steam bath. Sweat, cigarette smoke, instant noodles, all mixed together. The windows were open, but there was no breeze. I was leaning against the connection between two cars, my feet squeezed between other people's luggage, my head ducking under the woven bags jutting out from the overhead racks. And that's when your aunt squeezed her way over to me. Lily Shin. I repeated the name. It was unfamiliar, yet strangely familiar, the way the bed of a dried-up river still feels like a river, even when the water is gone. Yes, Lily Shin. Raymond's eyes brightened at the memory. She was a few years older than you are now, I'd say, early 20s. Wearing a floral print shirt, a ponytail, a canvas army green bag slung over her shoulder. She squeezed in next to me, dropped her bag at her feet, and wiped the sweat off her forehead with her sleeve. It was hot that day, and her face was flushed, tiny beads of sweat on the bridge of her nose. She was going to Changsha too. Raymond shook his head. No. She was going somewhere south of Changsha, a county town, I don't remember the name. But she talked to me the whole way. 6 hours, from Guangzhou to Changsha. She got off before I did. But in those 6 hours, I remembered her. What did she talk to you about? The old man didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window again, at the faint stars pressed against the dark glass. His profile, lit by the small reading light, showed a face cross-hatched with wrinkles, like a dry riverbed, each line a path where water used to flow. She showed me something in her bag, Raymond said, his voice dropping. A piece of paper. A birth certificate. I held my breath. A birth certificate with Lily Shin's name on it, Raymond continued, looking at me. But below the date of birth, there was another name, her biological mother's name. Iris Lin. Wait, my brain scrambled to catch up. Her biological mother. Then my grandmother. Lily Shen is your grandmother's daughter, Raymond cut me off, but she's not your grandmother's biological daughter. Your grandmother, Margaret Chen, 35 years ago. He stopped. The flight attendant's cart rolled past, wheels muffled against the carpet. The man in the next seat, who'd been snoring, rolled over and the snoring broke for a beat, then resumed. Raymond took a long breath, like he was pulling 35 years of weight into his lungs before letting it go. Your mother Margaret Chen, 35 years ago, gave a child back to Lily Shin's biological mother, he said. That child was Lily Shin. She was barely a year old. My brain took 3 full seconds to process that. 1. Aunt Lily isn't my grandmother's biological daughter. 2. My grandmother, my mother, gave the child back to her real mother. 3. Then who is my mother? Why did she have someone else's child? After 3 seconds, I heard my own voice come back from somewhere far away. Explain. Raymond pulled the yellowed notebook from his jacket again, opened it to a particular page, and handed it to me. On the page, in faded brown ink, was a line of handwriting. Lily Shen, female, born March 12, 1987. Biological mother, Iris Lin. Legal guardians, Margaret Chin, George Shin. Below that, a smaller line, added later, read, July 4, 1988. Iris Lin retrieved her daughter Lily Shin at Changsha South Railway Station. I stared at those lines like they were a foreign equation. Each character was familiar, but together they made no sense. 1988, I wasn't even born yet. Lily Shin. A name I'd never heard. Iris Lin. A completely unknown name. And my mother Margaret Chin, 35 years ago, handing a 1-year-old child to another woman. You're sure you're not mistaken? My voice was barely a whisper, afraid of disturbing something. Raymond closed the notebook but didn't put it away. He kept it on his lap, palm flat on the cover, like he was guarding something fragile. I was a journalist, he said. I never kept records I wasn't sure of. This notebook was my work log, every page has a date and a place. When I met your aunt on that train, she just learned she wasn't Margaret Chen's biological daughter. She was on her way to find her real mother. She showed me that birth certificate. She told me her foster parents had gone to America and left her behind. She couldn't understand why. I wrote it down because I thought it might be a good story. But I followed it for years afterward, and I realized it wasn't a story, it was someone's entire life. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, bumping softly. The snoring man next to us stirred, blinked at the ceiling, and passed out again. Raymond steadied himself, then pulled a pill from his pocket and washed it down with water. Bad heart, he said. Doesn't matter. I stared at him, unable to look away. His face was old, heavy bags under his eyes, liver spots scattered across his cheekbones. But his eyes weren't old. In those eyes, something burned beneath the surface, like fire in deep water, suppressed, but never extinguished. "Why did you keep following this?" I asked. "You could have just recorded it and moved on." Raymond was silent for a moment. He turned to the last page of his notebook, where a black and white photograph was tucked. A young woman with 2 braids, wearing a printed cotton shirt, standing next to a banana tree, grinning to show 2 prominent canines. "This is Iris Lynn," he said. "Lily Shin's biological mother. I went to find her later and showed her what I'd learned from her daughter on the train. She couldn't stand up from crying. She said she'd entrusted her daughter to her younger sister, hoping she'd have a better life. She never expected them to give the child back and leave themselves. She remarried later, life was hard, her daughter ran away as a teenager. She searched for half her life and never found her. You helped her search." Raymond tucked the photograph back into the notebook, gently. "I helped her for 25 years. Then she passed away, and I kept searching. Because I believe that a person should know where they came from, and where they've gone. Lily didn't know her mother was looking for her. Her mother didn't know what became of her daughter. I wanted to close that loop." The plane landed in San Francisco just past 2 in the morning. I said goodbye to Raymond at baggage claim. He pulled an old suitcase behind him, wheels clicking across the floor, his steps slow but steady. Before he disappeared into the crowd, he turned back and patted my shoulder. "Your parents must have had their reasons," he said. "But I told you this because I think you deserve to know. You're 32 years old. You're not that child anymore. I've carried this for too long, telling you finally lightened the load by a couple pounds." "How did you know I'd be on this flight?" I asked suddenly. Raymond paused. He looked back, a strange, rueful smile on his lips. "I didn't," he said. "I've taken this flight for 20 years. Every Tuesday, Boston to San Francisco. My daughter lives in Boston, I visit her once a month, and I fly back on this plane. I just happen to be here. But maybe some coincidences are meant to happen." He turned and walked away, the gray-blue jacket disappearing into the flow of departing passengers. I stood there, suitcase handle digging into my palm, airport announcements echoing overhead. I found myself replaying his words, asterisk every Tuesday, for 20 years star. Someone had been looking for something, for a very long time. I got home just before 3. The living room light was still on. My father George sat on the couch, the TV on mute, playing late-night news. When he saw me come in, he got up and took my bag, his movements carrying that familiar, practiced care. "Your mother's asleep. Hungry? There's congee in the fridge." I shook my head, taking off my shoes. Casually, I said, "Dad, do you know a journalist named Raymond Joe?" My father's hand stopped on the suitcase handle. The TV light flickered across his face, carving it into light and shadow for a split second. After about 2 beats, he said, "No." "Why?" "No reason," I said. "Just an old guy I met on the plane. Said he used to be a journalist in Hunan province, knew some Shan family members from around there. The relatives from Hunan have been cut off for a long time," my father said, his voice calm. But he wasn't looking at me. He turned and dragged the suitcase down the hallway, his back to me. "Get some rest." His steps were steady, each foot planted firmly before the next moved, the walk of a man trained in a chemical plant, where caution and stability were survival. I'd never seen him rattled. But just now, his right thumb had rubbed against the suitcase handle. A tiny movement, so small he probably didn't notice it himself. But I saw it. Clear as day. I didn't sleep right away. Lying in bed, I stared at the photo of Raymond's notebook page on my phone. That line, July 4, 1988, Iris Lin retrieved her daughter Lily Shin at Changsha South Railway Station. I read it over and over. July 4th, American Independence Day. The year my parents got their visas, ready to start a new life. And that little girl named Lily Shin was left behind at a train station. The next morning, my mother went to her tailor shop. A regular client needed a coat altered, she said, had to get it done in 2 days. My father went out for groceries, said he wanted to make pork rib soup since I was back. I sat alone in the living room, my eyes scanning every corner. I knew it wasn't right. But I couldn't stop my hands. I searched everywhere, the dusty old dictionaries on the top shelf, the storage bins under the bed, the layers of folded bed sheets in the closet, the boxes of junk in the basement that hadn't been opened in years. My mother is a seamstress, so the house is full of fabric and thread, but no amount of fabric can hide a secret forever. I dug for over an hour. I found old receipts, expired warranties, and a pile of yellowed clothing pattern sheets. Nothing else. Once I nearly dropped a heavy dictionary, catching it at the last second, my palms slick with sweat. Just as I was about to give up, my fingers found a recess on the underside of the television stand. A small tin box, attached with a strong magnet to the bottom. The moment my fingertips touched it, something clicked inside my chest. I pulled it off, my palms sweating. The box was about the size of my palm, painted with dark red lacquer that was chipped and peeling, revealing rusted metal beneath. There was a dent in one corner, like it had been dropped. The lid was tight, I had to pry it open with my nails. Inside were only 3 things. A photograph. A folded letter. A faded red cord. The photo was the kind of color print from the 1980s, faded at the edges, slightly blurry. 2 young women stood under a locust tree. The woman on the left wore a floral print shirt, a ponytail, and her eyes curved into crescents from laughing. The woman on the right wore a white round neck shirt, short hair, her smile shy and gentle. The woman on the left was clearly my mother, young, maybe early 20s, her face unlined, with something in her smile I'd never seen before, clean as mountain spring water. The woman on the right I didn't recognize. But she looked like my mother, same brow, same nose, only softer eyes, with a tiny mole at the corner of her mouth. I turned the photo over. On the back, in faded brown ink, the same handwriting as the notebook. Margaret and Iris, summer 1986. Iris Lin. My mother and the sister I never knew I had. Summer 1986. 2 years before the handoff at the train station. The folded letter was brittle at the edges, crumbling at the touch. I spread it on the coffee table and read it word by word, recognizing my mother's handwriting, messy but forceful, each stroke carved like a blade. It was addressed to Iris. It began with just 3 words. Dear sister, I'm sorry. The rest was patchy, some words blurred by water stains, some sentences cut off mid-thought, as if the writer had started and stopped many times. Here's what I could piece together. George and I have decided to go. The visas came through, we leave next month. Lily's situation, we thought about it for a long time. I know you entrusted her to us because you trusted us. But we can't take her. You're still young. When you get settled, you can raise her yourself. We're not her real parents, we can't make that decision for you. Sister, you carried her for 9 months. I waited outside the delivery room all night. I heard you screaming. I held her for a year, but she was always yours. I couldn't take her to America and make you never find her again. I took Lily to Changsha South Railway Station. July 4th. She waited for you in the waiting room. She was wearing the floral dress I bought her, carrying her little yellow backpack with a change of clothes and 2 handkerchiefs. She kept asking, when is Mama coming? I said, soon. I said, wait here, don't go anywhere. She grabbed my shirt and wouldn't let go. When I pulled her fingers off, she cried. I knelt down and held her. Her neck was sweaty, her hair damp, she smelled like baby powder. Then I stood up and walked away. I didn't look back. I made it to the exit and stopped, leaning against the wall, gasping like I'd run a marathon. I almost turned around. But I didn't. Because I thought that would be unfair to her, and unfair to you. She should be with her own mother. I never went back to check. I was afraid to see the moment you took her. Afraid that if I looked back, I wouldn't be able to leave. I've never made a harder decision in my life. But I know I did the right thing. She was your daughter, not mine. I couldn't be selfish and take a child that wasn't mine to a foreign country. But you don't know, sister, I cried the whole way on that train. George kept handing me handkerchiefs, one after another, until they were all soaked. I said I didn't deserve to be her mother, but I'd been her mother for a whole year. Every morning I braided her hair. Every night I told her stories. When she had a fever, I held her all night. I watched her learn to say, Mama, and when she did, my heart ached, because I knew the day would come when she'd have to go back to you. When that day came, I couldn't bear it. I gave her back to you, but I left a piece of myself in that waiting room. I know you can't forgive me. I couldn't forgive me either. But sister, believe me, I was good to her. Every single day of that year. When she called me Mama, it cut me like a knife. Every time I held her, I thought, this is my sister's child. I don't deserve to be called her mother. And yet I was greedy. I held on to that Mama for a whole year. Sister, if you hate me, I'll take it. Just know that on that afternoon, when I left her at the station, I was utterly broken. The letter was signed Margaret. Dated November 1988, a month before they immigrated. I refolded the letter and put it back in the box. Then I picked up the red cord. It was woven into a simple peace knot, with a small bead in the center, mellow yellow, like some kind of stone, glowing faintly in the light. The cord had faded to a dull crimson, but it was smooth to the touch, like it had been stroked again and again. The knot had a tiny loose thread at the join, twisted tight, a handmade touch. On the back of the photo, beside the first line of writing, I now noticed another line, smaller, in different handwriting, more delicate and light. Lily, nickname Lon Lon. Born March 12, 1987. She has a mole behind her right ear. I sat on the living room floor, back against the couch, the tin box clutched in my hands. I don't know how long I stayed there. The light outside shifted from pale morning white to noon gold, then began to slant into warm orange. The air conditioning cycled on and off, blowing the room cold and dry. My fingers were numb from gripping the box. When I finally let go, the edge of the lid had left rust marks across my palm. When my father came back, I was still sitting there. He pushed the door open, grocery bags in hand, celery stalks poking out green and crisp, a box of tofu making a square bulge in the bag, a pink plastic twist tie holding it all together. He saw me on the floor, saw the things spread across the coffee table, and the bag slipped from his grip. Plastic hit tile. A few celery leaves scattered. The tofu box cracked, gray liquid bleeding across the grout lines. He stood frozen, like a statue shocked mid-carve. You found them. His voice was soft. The man on the plane, I said, my voice equally quiet, like two conspirators in a locked room. His name is Raymond Zhou. He saw Mom at the Changsha train station in 1988, handing a child over to someone. He has a notebook. Lily's name, her birthday, the date, all of it. My father's lips moved, a chewing motion, or swallowing. He walked over slowly and sat on the couch across from me. His knee bumped the edge of the coffee table with a dull thud, but he didn't move it. "Your mother didn't want you to know," he said. "Why?" "Because she thought it was the thing she most failed at, when it came to your aunt. And the thing she most failed at, in terms of herself." "My aunt?" I looked up. "Dad, Aunt Lily isn't my grandmother. I mean, not my mom's biological daughter. Lily is my mom's sister's child." My father nodded. That nod was slow, like every muscle in his neck was resisting the motion. "Your mother told me the biggest regret of her life was not taking Lily with her. But she also thought it wouldn't have been fair to the child. That was Iris, your aunt. Her only daughter. Your mother and her sister were close. She didn't want your aunt to think she'd stolen her child. After we came to America, your mother thought about Lily every day. She'd wake up in the middle of the night and say, 'George, I had a dream that Lily was sitting alone on a bench at the train station, and it was getting dark, and nobody had come for her.' She had that dream for over a decade. But after she gave the child back, I pressed, 'What happened to Lily? Did she have a good life?'" My father's mouth twitched. He turned his face toward the window. The afternoon sun fell across his face, drawing a sharp line between light and shadow. His voice was rough as sandpaper. "Your mother asked around later. That child, Lily, had a hard life with her biological mother. Iris remarried, to a man who wasn't good to either of them. Lily ran away as a teenager and never went back. When your mother heard that, she fell apart for 2 weeks. Locked herself in her room, wouldn't leave, wouldn't cook, just stared at that red cord. Where did Lily go? Nobody knows." My father closed his eyes. "Your mother tried to find her. Years ago, she asked relatives back home to ask around. Someone said they'd seen a girl who looked like Lily in Guangzhou, working in a factory. Someone else said she'd gotten married in Shenzhen. Rumors, nothing confirmed. Every time your mother heard a rumor, she couldn't sleep for days, turning it over in her head. What if I'd taken her to America? What then? She was even afraid to find out for sure, afraid of hearing bad news, afraid that Lily wasn't even alive anymore. That fear was worse than not knowing." The tin box on the coffee table cast a small shadow in the afternoon light, a silent witness. "So you buried it completely? Never spoke of it?" My father let out a long sigh. He stood up, walked to the kitchen, picked up the scattered celery and the cracked tofu, wiped the floor. His movements were slow, as if he was using these small chores to delay the inevitable. Then he came back, sat down, and folded his hands on his knees. "Your mother said, 'Don't let Ethan know. If he knows, he'll feel like he has a sister or cousin he's never met. If he knows, he'll want to find her. If he finds her and she's not doing well, he'll resent us. If he can't find her, he'll carry it forever. Better to let him know nothing, let him live his own life cleanly.'" My father's voice cracked. "She was protecting you. And protecting herself, she was afraid that if you knew, the way you looked at her would change." "But I already know," I said. My father didn't speak again. He looked down at the tin box, like he was seeing it properly for the first time. When my mother came home, it was already dark. The moment she walked through the door and saw us sitting in the living room, the tin box open on the coffee table, the photo, the letter, the red cord laid out like 3 excavated remains, she stopped dead in the entryway. She was still wearing her tailor's shop white coat, pins clipped to the sleeves, a bamboo measuring tape tucked in her chest pocket. That uniform had been her uniform for more than a decade. I'd never seen her wear it with anything but composure. But in that moment, she covered her mouth with her thimble-clad hand, the silver band on her finger catching the light. "You found it?" she asked. "Mom," I stood up, "I met someone on the plane today. His name is Raymond Joe. He was on a train in 1988 and saw you hand a child over to someone. He said that child's name was Lily Shin. Your niece, Mom. I found this tin box under the TV stand. My mother's hand dropped from her mouth. She didn't cry, didn't shake her head, didn't deny it. She just walked slowly over, sat down beside my father, and lifted the tin box into her lap, cradling it like something that might shatter. Her thumb traced the chipped paint on the lid, over and over. Your aunt, she finally said, she wasn't a bad person. She was just too burdened. After her husband died, she couldn't handle everything alone. She gave Lily to me, said she'd take her back once she got on her feet. At the time, I thought, I'm her sister, I should help. Lily was so small, so soft, like a ball of cotton in my arms. The first time I held her, she smiled at me, and I knew I was done for. I already thought of her as mine. Her voice was steady, as if she'd said these words 1,000 times, just never out loud, never to anyone. Then the immigration visa came through. George and I talked for a month. Every night, we couldn't sleep. Take Lily with us. Or leave her. If we took her, your aunt would never see her again. If we left her, Lily would go back to a home that couldn't support her. I couldn't choose. I even went to a temple to burn incense and ask Buddha what to do. Buddha didn't answer. You decided to leave her, I said. I chose the stupidest path. My mother's fingers traced the red cord, slowly, gently. I chose to give her back and run to America. I couldn't bear to look at her, couldn't stay a second longer at that station. As I walked away, I told myself, once I'm settled in America, I'll come back for her. But I never did. Every time I thought about booking a ticket, I canceled at the last minute. I was afraid to see her, afraid she wouldn't recognize me, afraid she'd hate me, afraid she wouldn't even remember me. That fear was bigger than everything, bigger than all my guilt. Why? Because I was afraid. My mother looked up at me. The lamplight caught her face, and for the first time I noticed how deep the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes had become, like knife cuts. I was afraid she'd had a hard life. Afraid she'd hate me. I'd rather not know. But I couldn't help asking around. Every time I heard a scrap of news about her, I'd stay awake all night. One year I heard she might be in Guangzhou. I almost bought a ticket. I sat at the airport for 3 hours, then came back. When George came to pick me up, I was crouched on the parking lot floor crying. I said, I don't even know what she looks like anymore. How can I go find her? She paused, lifting the red cord to the light. The mellow yellow bead glowed warm and soft when the lamplight hit it. But I kept this cord. On the day she left, I untied it from my wrist and tucked it into her backpack. I was afraid she'd be scared alone, so I gave her something I'd made. Later, your aunt wrote to me and said Lily always wore it, she even wore it in the bath. When I read that, I cried in the kitchen all day long. I burned the dinner without even noticing. That night, the three of us sat in the living room and talked about things we'd never spoken of before. My mother told me about Iris, how they'd picked wild berries together in the mountains as children, washed clothes together by the river, secretly stolen brown sugar rice cakes from the kitchen when their grandmother wasn't looking. As she talked, her mouth would occasionally curve into a ghost of a smile, like footprints in the snow. Iris was 5 years older, always let me have her share. At New Year's, she'd give me the biggest piece of candy. When I went to boarding school, she walked 10 miles every week to bring me pickled vegetables and boiled eggs. When she got married and moved to the countryside in Hunan, I cried all night. I thought she'd left me forever. But she still sent letters every season, with photos inside, her smiling under a blue sky, rice fields and green mountains behind her. I never imagined that one day she'd be asking me to help raise her child, and that I'd give that child back and run away. That's the person I've failed most in this life. My father told the story of that day at the station, the heat, the floral dress, Lily asking over and over, "Where are we going?" My mother kneeling at the waiting room entrance, cupping Lily's face in her hands. "Mama's taking you to your real mama. She misses you. You be good." Lily holding onto her shirt, her tiny fingers clenched, her nails pressing into my mother's hand. "After your mother came back," my father said, "she didn't eat for 3 days. She'd wake up in the middle of the night and sit up in bed crying. She said she could hear Lily calling her Mama. That voice stayed in her ears for years. Every time she heard a little girl call for her mother, she'd startle. She thought it was Lily." My mother listened without speaking. She just wrapped the red cord around her wrist, once, twice, 3 times, measuring something that could never be fully measured. The lamp cast her shadow to one side, her shoulders barely trembling, but she didn't make a sound. Before bed, I asked my mother, "Did you ever really look for her? Really search?" She was silent for a long moment. Her finger had stopped at the last knot of the red cord. "I asked around," she said, "but it was always fragments. I didn't even remember what she looked like. She was barely a year old when she left. All I remembered was that she had a mole behind her right ear, very faint, you had to get close to see it. When I bathed her, I'd always touch that mole. Tiny, like a sesame seed." "I can find her," I said. My mother looked up. In her eyes, something flickered, like a frozen lake in deep winter, finally cracked open. "How?" "Raymond Joe," I said. "He's been looking for her for 35 years. He has a notebook with all the clues. The last address he found is in Guangzhou, a lane in Baiyun district where Lily used to work. She still goes back there once a month to pick up a small package she's left at a corner store. Nobody knows what's in it, but the old woman who runs the store says Lily always takes off her red cord and looks at it when she comes." My mother's hand clenched the edge of the tin box. Her lips began to tremble, and a thin, trapped sound escaped her throat. "That cord," she whispered, "she's still wearing it." "Apparently so." My mother slowly buried her face in her hands. This time, she cried, silently, only her shoulders shaking, like an old curtain trembling in the wind. The next morning, I called Raymond Joe. A young woman's voice answered, his daughter, Lisa. She said he'd been admitted to the hospital the day before, a heart problem that had flared up again. He was at St. Mary's, she said, and I was welcome to visit. When I got to the hospital, Raymond was in bed with an oxygen tube, the worn notebook on his bedside table. He grinned when he saw me come in, a thin cloud of condensation fogging the mask for a moment. "Find anything?" he asked. I sat down and showed him the photo and letter from the tin box. His fingers shook as he took the photo, holding it close to his eyes, and then he smiled, a deep, slow smile, like a well finely tapped. "That's her," he said. "Iris Lynn. Your mother and she could be sisters. But I knew the moment I saw you that you were a Shin, your nose and forehead are exactly your mother's. You look just like she did when she was young." "Mr. Zhou," I said, changing the address, "I want to find Lily. Do you have leads?" He took a yellowed slip of paper from beside his pillow and handed it to me. "An address in Guangzhou, Shayong North Street, Baiyun District, the corner store." The handwriting was messy, written in a hurry. "This is the last location I found, about 3 years ago," he said. "Lily worked around there. She moved on, but someone told me she still goes back once a month to pick up a small package she'd left with the store. Nobody knows what's inside. But the shopkeeper said that every time Lily picks it up, she takes off the red cord from her wrist and looks at it for a while. Sometimes she even talks to it, like she's talking to someone invisible." "Have you ever met her in person?" Raymond shook his head. "Once. About 10 years ago, outside a garment factory in Guangzhou. I saw someone who looked like Iris Lin when she was young, from a distance. But I didn't go up to her. She was carrying a plastic bag, walking fast, head down. I called out, "Lily." She paused for a moment, but she didn't turn around, she walked even faster. I never saw her after that. But I knew she was still in that area. I looked at him. The faded red cord, the one my mother had made, was waiting in the dark of the tin box, waiting for its match. "Mr. Zhou, why did you persist all these years?" I asked. "You're not her family. You had no obligation." He was quiet for a long time. He adjusted his oxygen tube and stared at the ceiling, as if looking at something very far away. "When I was a young journalist, I covered too many broken families. Most of them just scattered and nobody ever picked up the pieces. But Lily was different. When I saw her on that train, her eyes had a light in them, not anger, not sadness, but that hunger to know who she really was. I was a journalist for 30 years, I've looked into a lot of eyes, and I saw that light only 3 times. She deserved an answer. Then her mother came to me asking for help in finding her daughter, and I agreed. When I give my word, I keep it." He handed me the notebook. "Take it. All the records are in there. I won't need it anymore." I took the notebook. The cover was worn white, edges curled, like it had been opened thousands of times. The first page, dated July 4, 1988, recorded the meeting on the train, the handwriting young and firm. The last page, from last winter, read, "Lily Shin, still unaccounted for." A question mark had been drawn and crossed out. "Go," Raymond said softly. "For me, and for her mother, go see how she's doing now." 3 days later, I boarded a flight to Guangzhou. Before I left, I called my mother. On the other end, her voice was gentle, like she was afraid of breaking something. "When you get there, don't startle her. First see how she's doing. Don't rush to say who you are. If she's struggling, just tell her you're passing through. If she seems okay, then tell her. And tell her this, tell her that the person who left her at the station all those years ago has never forgotten that she had a mole behind her right ear." "I will." She paused a few seconds. "Did you bring the red cord?" "Yes." "Good." She hung up. As the plane flew over the Pacific, I leafed through Raymond's notebook, page by page. Addresses, phone numbers, names, timelines, and occasional brief personal notes. One page read, ** went to the police station today to check household records. Couldn't find Lily Shin. Might have changed her name, might have moved away. But Iris told me her daughter has a mole behind her right ear. That mark won't change. ** Another read, ** someone said they saw her selling socks at a night market in Liwan district. I looked for a month. Didn't find her, ** and another, ** Iris is sick, liver cancer, advanced. She held my hand in the hospital bed and said, "Raymond, I don't think I'll live to see her again. Please tell my daughter that her mother never abandoned her. Her mother was just too poor to raise her." Next to that, in red ink, Iris Lin, died March 14, 2017. I closed the notebook and looked out the window. Below, the Pacific spread endlessly, white clouds glowing in the sun. I pictured that woman, Iris Lin, reaching out in her final days to a stranger, and trusting him with a lifetime of longing. And I pictured the girl, Lily, sitting in that train station waiting room, waiting for her mother to come, waiting until the sky darkened, until a strange woman came and held her. Then she grew up, moved from place to place, always wearing the same faded red cord. The plane landed in Guangzhou under a light rain. Shayong North Street was a narrow alley lined with old residential buildings from the 1980s. On the ground floor, small shops were wedged together, a grocery store, a fruit stand, a noodle shop. The air smelled of soy sauce, steamed buns, and the wet concrete after rain. I followed the numbers, my feet splashing on the wet brick, water spots darkening my pant legs. The grocery store was tiny, its shelves dusty and half-stocked. Behind the counter sat an old woman in reading glasses, shelling edamame, one bean at a time, each dropping into an enamel bowl with a small ting. I walked up and showed her the photo of the red cord. She took off her glasses, leaned in, studied it for a long while, then nodded. I know this cord. A woman comes by every so often. She leaves a small bundle here and picks it up, just holds it, looks at it, puts it back. She always wears a blue jacket, doesn't say much, comes and goes. When does she come next? The old woman thought for a moment. Around the 15th of each month. She pointed to the calendar on the wall. Today's the 14th. She should come tomorrow afternoon, around 3. I thanked her and stepped out. The noodle shop across the way was still open. I sat down by the window, ordered a plate of rice noodles and a cup of hot tea, and watched the grocery store's metal shutter. The noodles came, thin, silky, the soy sauce sweet and salty, but I couldn't taste them. I ate mechanically, lifted, chewed, swallowed. The tea went cold. I asked for a refill, 3 times. The color went from golden to pale. In the afternoon, sunlight leaked through the gaps between buildings, falling on the wet brick in patches. The alley came alive with people, a water delivery man on an electric scooter, an auntie with a grocery basket, schoolchildren with backpacks. Their daily lives overlapped with my waiting, like 2 transparent sheets laid on top of each other. At 3:17, a woman in a dark blue coat walked into the grocery store. She was short, slightly heavy-set, her hair cut short with a few gray strands at the temples. Her eyebrows were light, her eyes small but sharp. She carried a small cloth bag, and her steps were heavy, as if each one was a negotiation with gravity. She said something to the old woman behind the counter. The old woman reached down and handed her a small wrapped bundle. She took the bundle but didn't open it. She just held it, lowering her head, as if waiting for something. The sun slanted across the store's doorstep, falling on her shoulders. The blue coat was faded, the cuffs frayed. I pushed open the noodle shop's glass door. As I crossed the street, my steps were quick, shoes slapping on the wet brick. She must have heard the sound, because she looked up at me. Her gaze was wary, the look of an animal used to avoiding people, ready to retreat. Then she saw the red cord on my wrist. The cord my mother had given me, she'd taken it from the tin box and tied it on me before I left. "Tie it tight," she'd said. "Don't lose it." I've reknotted this cord so many times over 35 years. The last time I tied it, I told myself, if someone wearing its match ever comes, that's the debt I still owe. The woman stared at the red cord on my wrist. Her lips parted, then closed. Her eyes reddened rapidly, as if scalded by something hot. She gripped the bundle so tight her knuckles stood out white, the bones sharp against her skin. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. "My name is Ethan," I said. "Margaret Chin is my mother." "That cord on your wrist," she made it. The bundle dropped from her hand. It landed softly on the doormat, with a muffled thump. She stepped back, her back hitting the doorframe. Her expression was a blank canvas at first, then overwhelmed by a wave of emotions too complex to name: grief, anger, confusion, and something softer, all colliding at once. "Your mother," she said, her voice shaking, "is she okay? She's been looking for you." She lowered her head. After a long moment, she raised her wrist. There it was, the red cord, faded to the same dull crimson as the one in the tin box, the knot loose from decades of wear. A bead, the same mellow yellow, hung from it, swaying gently in the afternoon light. The cord beneath it was polished smooth, as if it had been stroked 1,000,000 times. I slowly untied the cord from my own wrist and held it out toward her. The two red cords hung close in the shade, like two dry riverbeds finally meeting the same rain. She reached out and took it. Her fingers were long, calloused, nails clipped short and clean. She held the cord tight, the ends pressing red marks into the gaps between her fingers. Then she looked up, her face wet with tears, but she smiled, an old smile, like a photograph pressed for 35 years, finally unfolded. "The cord she made," she said. "I never changed it." The shopkeeper brought out 2 plastic stools, and we sat under the store's awning. A light drizzle had started again, fine as mist, gathering on our hair in tiny droplets. Lily wiped her face with her sleeve and placed both red cords side by side on her knees, studying them for a long time. She looked carefully, as if examining every stitch of a long and tangled life. "Your mother," she started, her voice still rough, "did she know I come here to pick up the package?" "No. I found you through Raymond Joe, the old journalist who was on that train when your mother left you at the station. He spent 35 years looking for you." Lily blinked. She looked down the alley, where the drizzle had blurred the edges of the street lamps. "Raymond Joe," she repeated. "I saw him once. About 10 years ago, outside a garment factory. An old man called my name. I glanced back, didn't recognize him, kept walking. Later, I heard that a retired journalist from Southern Metropolitan Daily was looking for someone named Lily. I thought he was a scammer. I ignored it. He's not a scammer. He knew your mother. She looked for you her whole life, and on her deathbed, she asked him to keep searching." Lily's fingers clenched the cords. Her shoulders jerked, as if she'd been pushed from behind. She lowered her head as rain mixed with tears, running from her temples down her cheeks. "My mother," she said, "she died. 2017. Lily didn't speak again. She just sat there, shoulders heaving silently, her head bowed. The shopkeeper brought out a cup of hot tea, set it by her hand, patted her shoulder softly, and stepped back inside. After a long time, Lily lifted her head. Her eyes were as red as embers, but her expression was settling. "I want to know," she said, "why your mother left me behind. Did she not love me?" "No." I said it firmly. "She loved you. She loved you so much. She took care of you like her own child for a whole year. She braided your hair every morning, told you stories every night, stayed up all night when you had a fever. She left you because she thought you weren't hers, you were your mother's, and she couldn't steal you. She regretted it for the rest of her life. She wrote a letter to your mother saying she was shattered that day. I have it here. Do you want to see it?" Lily shook her head, then nodded, then just reached out her hand. I took out the photocopy. The original was too fragile to bring. She took it and read it word by word, her lips moving soundlessly. Halfway through, she pressed the paper against her chest, closed her eyes, and let out a long, slow breath. "The floral dress she mentioned," Lily said, opening her eyes, "I remember it. I've gone through old photos so many times, and one of them shows me wearing it, yellow background, small white flowers, lace trim on the sleeves. I've kept that photo with me all this time. Do you remember her at all?" Lily was quiet for a moment. "I was too young to remember her face. But I remember a smell, the smell of flour and soap on her. Every time I caught that smell somewhere, I'd feel warm inside. I didn't know why until I was older. It was the smell of mother. She wasn't my biological mother, but that smell stayed with me my whole life." She pulled an old wallet from her pocket and opened the inner compartment, drawing out a small black and white photo. It showed a young woman holding a baby. The woman's face was washed out by the camera flash, but the features were distinct. It was my mother, younger. The baby wore a floral dress, mouth open and a toothless grin. I found this among my mother Iris's things after she died, Lily said. She'd kept it all along. So did I. Sometimes I think my life has been strange. 2 mothers, one who gave birth to me and couldn't raise me, one who raised me and couldn't keep me. They both loved me, but we were always separated. She let out a bitter laugh. But I never blamed your mother, she said. I've wondered what my life would have been if she'd taken me to America. Maybe better, maybe not. But that was her choice. She chose what she thought was right. I don't hate her. Sometimes I miss her. I wonder what she looked like, what her voice sounded like, whether her hands were warm when she held me. When I was a child, I'd see other children being picked up from school by their mothers, and I'd stand there watching, imagining that my mother had that face. She always remembered that you have a mole behind your right ear, I said. Lily tilted her head and lifted her hair behind her ear. There it was, a tiny light brown mole, almost invisible in the dim light. Every time she bathed me, she'd touch that mole, Lily said, letting her hair fall back. She remembered. She actually remembered. The rain was slowing. A crack opened in the clouds, and a beam of sunlight fell through, striking the wet bricks with a soft glow. I took out my phone and called my mother on video. 2 rings, and she picked up. Her face appeared on the screen, background the living room at home, her sitting on the couch, my father right next to her, their heads close together like 2 nervous children. Mom, I said, look who I'm with. I turned the camera toward Lily. Lily saw the face on the screen, the same brows, the same nose, the same contours, and for a moment, she went completely still. Then she clapped her hand over her mouth. On the other end, my mother did the same. 2 people 10,000 miles apart, separated by a screen and 35 years, looking at each other, neither speaking. A very long time passed. My mother spoke first, her voice shattered like thin ice. Lon, is it really you? Lily's tears came in a rush. She couldn't speak, just nodded frantically, wiping the screen with her sleeve again and again, as if trying to wipe the distance between them. Mama, she finally said. The word came out soft and trembling, like a leaf settling on water. On the screen, my mother stood up abruptly, turned away, her shoulders shaking violently. My father patted her back and took the phone. Lily, wait for us, he said. We're booking flights. We'll come see you. Lily laughed through tears. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. I've already waited 35 years. A couple more days won't hurt. After they hung up, Lily took both red cords and wrapped them together around her wrist, twice around, and tied a knot. The 2 cords lay side by side, different shades of faded crimson, but their knots matched perfectly, every loop of the piece knot aligned. Your mother's craft hasn't changed, Lily said, looking at the cords on her wrist. Same tightness, same density. She must have focused so hard when she made these, like the old tailors I used to watch. She's a seamstress, I said. Lily paused, then laughed. That laugh was faint, but warm, like the first ray of sun after rain. No wonder I became a seamstress too, she said. I worked in garment factories for 15 years. I can bind edges, make patterns, sew an entire shirt. I guess I inherited it from her, not through blood, but through that urge to keep your hands busy. I looked at her wrist again, the 2 red cords swaying in the pale light. You kept her cord with you, I said. All these years. Wherever you went. Lily looked down at the cords and gently brushed the mellow yellow bead. That's the only proof I have that she was real, she said. She made me a cord. This cord is real. So the fact that she loved me, that has to be real too. That evening, Lily took me to her home, a small room on the top floor of a 6-story building in a lane not far from the grocery store. A single bed, a desk, a simple wardrobe, and an old sewing machine in the corner. On the windowsill sat a lush pothose plant, its vines trailing down almost to the floor. She poured me a glass of water and sat on the edge of the bed. "I left home at 15, she said. Worked 2 years at an electronics factory in Shenzhen, then moved to Guangzhou and spent more than a decade in garment factories. I've moved around, changed apartments. But I've always carried this cord, and that photo of your mother holding me. I don't have much of value, just those 2 things. You never went back to find your biological mother." "Iris?" Lily lowered her head, silent for a while. "I did. When I was 17, I went back, found the village. I stood on the hill across from the house and watched my mother sitting outside, shelling beans. I watched for a long time, but I didn't go in. There was a man with her, smoking. I didn't know if it was my stepfather. I was afraid of making things harder for her. I went back twice more, at 20, and at 25, just to look from a distance, then leave. Until she died, I never walked up to her. Why? I didn't know how to face her." Lily's voice was quiet. "She sent me away, then took me back, but those years she raised me, she didn't have it easy. She remarried, and my stepfather wasn't good to me. She was caught in the middle, trying to keep everyone happy. I know she struggled. But she never held me, never told me she loved me. After I left, she didn't come looking. Maybe she was afraid too. We were both afraid of hate, afraid of rejection, afraid that the words we couldn't say would crush whatever was left between us." She paused, looking at the cord on her wrist. "But your mother was different. She made this cord for me. She remembered the mole behind my ear. She wrote that letter with so many words. She's the only person who made me feel like someone actually cared enough to give me back, and cared enough to hurt for a lifetime because of it." "She did hurt for a lifetime," I repeated. "I know," Lily said. "I know that now. That pain is real." I read her letter, and every word cut deep. On the day she left me, she turned back to look at me. She cried the whole train ride home. She couldn't take me, but she left a piece of herself with me. And I did the same. I moved so many times, changed so many identities, but I kept this cord. I kept that smell in my memory. We were separated, but we were never truly broken apart. As night fell, Lily got up to cook. In her tiny kitchen, she chopped, stirred, sautéed with practiced ease. The smell of garlic and ginger filled the small room. While she cooked, she talked, filling the gaps of 35 years of silence. "What do you do?" she asked. "Data engineer." "What's data?" "Numbers. I manage numbers on computers." "Oh. That's different from me. I manage cloth and thread." We both laughed. Later, during dinner, she remembered something and pulled a small cloth pouch from her drawer. Inside was a folded piece of paper, the original birth certificate. Lily Shin, female, born March 12, 1987. Mother, Iris Lin. Guardians, Margaret Chin, George Shin. In the corner, in Raymond's handwriting, July 4, 1988, Changsha South Railway Station, Iris Lin retrieved her daughter. "I've carried this for 35 years, Lily said. Closer to me than my ID. Sometimes I think it's proof that I existed, that I was born, raised, given away, taken back. I'm made of all those decisions." "Would you want to see Raymond show?" I asked. She thought for a moment, then nodded. "I would. I want to thank him. He'd never even met me, and he searched for half my life. If I can tell him that, he'll know his time wasn't wasted. 3 days later, my parents flew into Guangzhou. I met them at the airport. My mother looked entirely different from how I'd ever seen her. She was wearing a new red coat, her hair carefully combed, a pair of pearl earrings she hadn't worn in years. She stood at the arrival's exit, clutching a cloth bag tied tight at the top. "What's inside?" I asked. "For her," my mother said. "I made it myself." We took a cab to Shayong North Street. The noodle shop was still open, and the old woman from the grocery store stood outside in the sun. Lily was already waiting, wearing a clean white blouse, dark blue pants, her hair tucked behind her ears, revealing that faint little mole. When my mother got out of the cab, she stumbled. I reached to steady her, but she waved me off and found her footing. She walked toward the grocery store doorway, one step at a time, each foot placed firmly, like she was completing a journey that had taken a very long time. Lily stood still. Her lips trembled, but her body was steady. My mother reached her, and they stood one pace apart, looking at each other. My mother raised her hand first. Slowly, she lifted it, fingers pointing upward, hovering in the space between them, waiting. Lily looked at that hand. It was an old hand now, knuckles thick, fingertips scarred from needles, nails trimmed neat. That hand had braided a red cord, written a long letter, held a 1-year-old girl close, then let her go 35 years ago. Lily placed her hand inside it. My mother gripped it tight. Two rough hands held each other with the same warmth. Then my mother stepped forward and pulled Lily into an embrace, tight and heavy, as if both were pressing 35 years of weight into that single moment. She buried her face in Lily's shoulder, and her shoulders began to shake. Lily lifted her arms and wrapped them around my mother's back, patting softly, like comforting a child. "Auntie Margaret," Lily said, "I'm here." My mother's sob came from deep in her throat, low, long, like a river blocked for years finally breaking through. She said "I'm sorry" over and over, as if trying to carve those words into the very air. Lily didn't say "it's okay." She just kept patting my mother's back and said, "I've been wearing your cord all this time." That afternoon, they sat together under the awning and talked for hours. My mother opened the cloth bag and pulled out a garment, a brand new floral print shirt, yellow background with small white flowers, lace trim on the sleeves. The exact same style as the one Lily had worn 35 years before. "I made it from memory," my mother said. "I don't know if the size is right." Lily took it, shook it open, held it up against her chest. She laughed softly, then pressed the shirt against her heart like she was holding someone she'd just been reunited with. "Perfect," she said. My father stood a few paces away, hands in his pockets, watching. His eyes were red too, but he didn't step closer, just watched, like he was guarding the scene from anything that might disturb it. "Lisa Zhou sent me a text, Dad heard you found her. He's been in good spirits all day. He said the stone on his heart has finally been lifted." I showed the message to Lily. She read it, then spoke to the phone screen, asking Lisa to pass this on to her father. "Mr. Zhou, I'm doing well. Thank you." That evening, we had dinner in Lily's small room. My mother and Lily made dumplings together, chive and egg filling, the wrappers rolled by hand. They stood at the tiny table, one rolling dough, one filling and folding, moving in sync like they'd been doing it together their whole lives. At the table, my mother rewrapped the red cord, adding a new bead she'd bought, identical to the original mellow yellow stone. She wove the two cords into one, making a double-piece knot, and tied it back around Lily's wrist. "You don't have to keep them separate anymore," my mother said. "They're together now." Lily looked at the newly braided cord on her wrist. She didn't say thank you. She just raised her wrist to the lamplight and studied it for a long, long time. I went back to America. Lily stayed in Guangzhou, but she video called my mother every month. They talked about daily life, sewing techniques, the weather, as if the lost 35 years had never happened. But they both knew they had happened. Every minute, every second. And because they had, every call now was precious. Raymond Shaw passed away the following spring. He went peacefully, his notebook on the bedside table, open to the last page. On that page, I'd written a line for Lisa to add, "Lily found. She is doing well." Beside it was a photo of Lily and my mother, beaming under the awning of the grocery store. Lisa said he spent his final days looking at that photo, smiling as he looked. My mother never went back to Guangzhou. But she put a new frame on the living room shelf, a photo of Lily standing under the locust tree in Shayong North Street, wearing that floral shirt, the double piece not visible on her wrist. The letter was folded and returned to the tin box, but the box wasn't hidden under the TV stand anymore. It sat on the bookshelf, next to photo albums and vases, an honest part of the household now. Sometimes I think about that flight. About Raymond saying, 6 hours, long enough for a story. He told a story that spanned 35 years. It had 3 women, 2 mothers, 1 daughter, and a red cord. That cord is still on Lily's wrist. She says she'll wear it until it fades to white, until the knot wears thin and breaks. And when it breaks, she'll weave it again. Just like those broken threads, as long as someone is willing to tie them back together, they can always be mended. I'm back in San Francisco now, typing code at my 3 screens. But I don't feel that hollow space in the house anymore. That space has been filled by someone named Lily, filled by a red cord, filled by an echo that began on July 4, 1988, and finally found its ground. Sometimes I work late, driving home alone. At a red light, my hand will reach for my wrist without thinking. There's nothing there. But I always feel a phantom cord tied around it, one end connected to me, the other to a place very far away. I think that's the grip of a little girl in a floral dress, holding onto an adult's shirt in the waiting room of Changsha South Railway Station, 35 years ago. That grip never disappeared. It just traveled a very long road, halfway around the world, and found its way back to where it belonged. 35,000 feet up, a secret was unlocked. And on the ground, someone was readying a cord.